The barrier islands of the eastern shore of Virginia are today the longest chain of undeveloped, uninhabited barrier islands along the eastern seaboard of the United States, and indeed one of the longest in the world. Managed for conservation, there remain few traces of the many people who once lived, worked, and played in the villages, life-saving stations, hotels, and fancy hunt clubs that once thrived on these islands. The Barrier Island Center preserves this cultural history. Come, join us for a tour of the museum galleries. The Cobbs Island Hotel was one of the best-known resorts on the East Coast in the late 1800s. The hotel was a sportsman's paradise and featured a chapel, bowling alley, fine dining room, and a ballroom with musical entertainment. The rich and famous visitors came for the excellent waterfowl hunting, fishing, and the wide stretch of beach for which the island was famous. Guests also appreciated the Cobbs family, who owned and operated the hotel. Originally from Massachusetts, Nathan Cobbs Sr. and his three sons, Nathan Jr., Warren, and Albert, were highly regarded sportsmen whose hunting and fishing skills were legendary. Today, their skillfully carved hunting decoys are prized by collectors. In contrast to the luxuries demanded by the hotel guests, the Cobbs' own homes were simple and practical. Cobbs Island was also home to one of the 8 U.S. Life-Saving Service stations built on the Virginia Barrier Islands between 1875 and 1880. The Cobbs had run a successful salvaging business on the island. Due to the many shipwrecks along the shoals, and members of the Cobbs family worked as crew members in the life-saving service once it was established. The other stations on Smith, Hogg, Paramore, Cedar, Wetumpka, Wallops, and Assateague Islands also employed full-time crews, many of whom were locals familiar with the treacherous waterways. The Iron Men of the life-saving crews conducted many daring and difficult rescues. When the life-saving service was incorporated into the U.S. Coast Guard, the stations on Virginia's Barrier Islands continued to be important through the 1960s. Mockhorn Island is an interior island owned by the state of Virginia today. The Cushman family bought the island in the early 1900s after making their fortune in the bakery business in New York. They built a 2-story hunting lodge with all the latest modern conveniences, including refrigerated rooms, electricity, riding stables, bridle paths, and a cultivated garden. To protect their investment, they erected a large seawall. But even these costly measures were not enough to withstand the storms and depression of the 1930s. Hogg Island was home to Broadwater, a thriving community of 250 people, complete with a school, church, general store, and post office. The families all looked forward to the 4th of July and celebrated with a big picnic and a baseball game, where the Hogg Island men played against men from the mainland. A ferry and mail boat provided regular transportation to the island, which also boasted a hotel and a private hunt club. Fishing and hunting enthusiasts, including President Grover Cleveland, enjoyed visiting Hogg Island, along with many others who came for the long sandy beaches. Broadwater residents were a tight-knit community of hardy families who understood the tides and waters and were largely self-sufficient. But by the late 1930s, a series of storms, including the Great Hurricane of 1933, forced the islanders to pack up their homes and float them by barge to the mainland. Sheep were very important to the families who lived on the island, and most women had a spinning wheel to make the wool into yarn for clothing. Today, Hog Island sheep are recognized as a distinct breed that is closely related to the original British colonial sheep first brought to the islands. Although there are only about 250 left in the world, there are ongoing efforts to keep the breed alive. Boats were critical to islanders, who had to learn how to make, navigate, and repair their own vessels. Children's earliest toys were often boats, and many children had small boats in which they learned to sail. Many of the islanders were watermen who depended on their boats to fish or dig up oysters, scallops, or clams for their livelihood. Gunning skiffs were used to hunt the abundant ducks, geese, and other shore birds that flew over the islands in large flocks. Wildfowl hunting has a long and storied tradition along Virginia's barrier islands. Hunters carved decoys to help lure migrating birds. Today, Eastern Shore decoys are celebrated as an art form and have become valuable collectibles. Local carvers, past and present, are recognized as some of the best in the world. Among the many hunt clubs established on Virginia's barrier islands during their golden era between the Civil War and the Depression, the Accomack Club, built in the marshes of Paramore Island, may have been the most opulent. Created by wealthy New Yorkers, club membership was limited to 35 gentlemen, and there was always a wait list of those wanting to join this elite club. An annual regatta included large prizes for the race winners and plentiful food and drink. But the Depression took its toll, and by the time of the massive 1933 hurricane, the club was down to only 6 members. The 1930s, with the double whammy of the Depression and a series of severe storms, marked the end of an era for Virginia's barrier islands. Hotels and hunt clubs were destroyed, and even the hardy villagers moved off the islands. Only the Coast Guard crews remained, and by the 1960s, even those stations were decommissioned. Today, the only sounds on the islands are the pounding surf and migrating birds. Even though the people and families of the islands have left, the Barrier Island Center preserves their traditions and vibrant stories.